Okay, I'd like to point to three passages here as articulating one strain of thought about how the parity and primacy theses can go together, how he understands this. So the first is passage 15 on page 3. He says, a fundamental question with respect to any conceptual framework is of what sort are the basic objects of the framework? This question involves, on the one hand, the contrast between an object and what can be true of it in the way of properties, relations, and activities, and on the other, a contrast between the basic objects of the framework and various kinds of groups they can compose. So presumably that second one is the distinction between the basic objects and the other objects. It's that first distinction that I want to focus on here. He's distinguishing between, to use Quine's terminology, the ontology of the conceptual scheme. What things does it take to exist, and what Quine called the ideology of it. What does it take to be true of those things? Now we've seen that distinction is very important to him when he's got his nominalist hat on. The ideology side, the things that are true of, the things you can describe those objects as, those have a very different status. Those properties, relations, propositions, facts are not proper terms referring to things. They're disguised metalinguistic ways of talking about talking rather than about what's in the world. In passage 41, which is from 389, so 12 pages later in the essay, I distinguished above between the unification of the postulated entities of two sciences and the unification of the sciences. It's also necessary to distinguish between the unification of the theoretical entities of two sciences and the unification of the theoretical principles of those two sciences. And I want to line this up with the ontological, ideological distinction. So, in 42, there is consequently an ambiguity in the statement, the laws of biochemistry are special cases of the laws of physics. It may mean, A, biochemistry needs no variables which cannot be defined in terms of the variables of atomic physics. Well, variables here, term variables, individual constants. And B, the laws relating to certain complex patterns of subatomic particles, the counterparts of biochemical compounds, are related in a simple way to laws pertaining to less complex patterns. The former, of course, is the only proposition to which one is committed by the identification of the theoretical objects of the two sciences in the sense described above. Well, here's a way he could be reconciling these things, using a line of thought that seems to be in play in those three nominalism essays. It could be that the primacy of the scientific image over the manifest image is at the level of ontology, of what the objects are, and the parity of the manifest image and the scientific image is at the level of the ideology, of what we say of them. You could read the Scientia Mensura this way. And the Scientia Mensura says, in the dimension of describing and explaining, not everything, because we do other things besides that, science is the measure of all things, of those that are that they are. He doesn't say that they are and what they are. He just says that they are. Existence of the objects doesn't commit himself. Now, that could be stylistic. He's picking up the Parmenidean slogan and would be, uglying it up by putting, another clause, that they are and what they are in there. It could just be stylistic. On the other hand, all he actually claims the primacy for there is that science gets to say what things there are. That's leaving what's true of them, their properties, their relations, the facts about them. Officially, he's not committing himself to that. So it's open when he's thinking of the relation of the objects and the terms that refer to them in the manifest image to the objects of the scientific image, to say it's a world of things, not of facts. The Kotarbinsky Realism, that's a matter of what the real names are. And science has its primacy and its authority over those existential matters. What things are there to talk about? But these things that he, in those nominalism essays, says are not in the world in the narrow sense, the sense in which there's just the particulars in the world. They're only in the world in the broader sense that includes our doings. Well, that's true for him of facts. So it's open to him, at least, to say, as far as stating the facts about these things, there are manifest image facts about them and there are scientific image facts about them. But what they are, the scientific image is authoritative about. After all, he thinks that talk about those properties, relations, propositions, and facts, those aren't proper names. Those are onomatoids. That's Kotarbinsky's term, because they're all formed by nominalizations. And basically thinks all the nominalizations form fake names, only names of things that are in the world in a broader sense. This is the line that I think is a really bad idea. Because I think there's no go at all to the idea of identifying the objects referred to by manifest image terms with the objects identified by scientific image terms. To introduce a kind of object, you have to introduce common nouns, sortals, that go with it. He's down with that, but those have an ideological component to them. They don't just have criteria of identity and individuation, they have criteria of application as well, and the criteria of identity and individuation, no less than the criteria of application, are articulated by concepts, predicates, relational expressions. He's okay with terms like dog as a common noun. That's talking about what there really is, talking about objects. not doghood or dogness. The only way to nominalize that is with his distributive singular terms. So the dog is loyal, something like that. But Fido is a dog is a predication. That's saying something true of Fido. That's ideology, not ontology. So you've got to think about what vocabulary those sortals are in. And on this hypothesis, we'd be saying, well, the objects that are there are the ones that are picked out by the sortals in the language of science. And those are the same objects that are picked out under different sortals, the sortals of the manifest image. And I want to observe that it's almost never true that objects picked out under different sortals are identical. Trans-sortal identities are rare. So you can say things like, sometimes there are overarching sortals. You can say, this kitten is identical to that cat. I think you can't really say, this passenger is identical with this person. You identify and individuate them differently. This line of thought I argue at length in the From Empiricism to Expressivism book, but the basic idea is when you identify and individuate an object, that involves all sorts of subjunctively robust commitments about it. And the subjunctives work differently for objects that fall under one sortal than they do for objects that fall under another sortal. Now, there's a huge philosophical literature about this question. Geach took the same sort of considerations that I'm urging here and says identity itself is sortal relative. He wants to say, when you ask whether, if you see me getting on the plane in Pittsburgh and getting off the plane in Toronto, and you know, is that the same as that? Well, it's the same person and not the same passenger. The answer to the identity depends on what the sortals are. Almost everybody thinks that's the wrong way to think about identity. Gupta's dissertation and then book, The Logic of Common Nouns, shows us how we don't have to have that. But things that are identical share all their properties, including their subjunctive properties. The only things they don't are, as it were, de dicto properties, things that you would attribute inside a propositional attitude ascription. The tradition thinks, no, they only need to share extensional properties, not modal properties, but there actually aren't any empirical properties that don't have necessary conditions that are subjunctive. You know, to call something a lion or say it's copper is to commit yourself about what would have happened. In semantic-metaphysical discussions of this, one of the people who's argued most forcefully for the way of thinking about this that I'm recommending is Kripke, denying that there are contingent identities, which is a way of claiming that identicals have to share all their modal properties as well as all of their non-modal properties, if there are any non-modal empirical properties. So I think this line of thought is present in Sellars. Why is he distinguishing in this way the objects of the two theories from what's said about them, and saying, the sense of reducibility that he's interested in is just the identification of the objects, not the things that are true of them. But I think in the end this is not an intelligible conception, and that insofar as this thread is in play, he would have been better to extrude it.
I'm just wondering if, so if you just consider a biological entity, right, and you make this reduction claim that really all the entities that are here are the entities given by, say, particle physics or whatever. And then you say, well, so biology delivers these principles, and then from these principles we can employ this vocabulary that enables us to track these sort of complexes of biological, particle, ultimately, physical ontology. And then the thought is, you're not going to be able to, because biological entities don't maintain all of the same parts in terms of the sort of physical parts. You're not going to be able to sort of continually sort of say, well, it's this set of particles or something like that. But nevertheless, the thought would be that you'll be able to sort of think that all the entities that are really there are the particles, and then there's these sort of principles that presumably... Anyway, so the thought in that case would be the criteria for sort of the individuation of the object isn't given by the principles of particle physics, but it's consistent with that all the entities that are really there are the...
that's the thought I'm contesting.
Okay.
That you can say that. So, if you're a Lewisian, you think, well, whatever the ultimate particles are, physics will tell us about, and what's real is those particles and mereological sums of those particles. Now, you can't identify a cat with the mereological sum of anything, so we need to say, well, it's the mereological sum of these particles arranged cat-wise, or something like that. That's what's doing the sortal work, is that arranged cat-wise. And that's not something you could say in the language of particle physics, or in the language of cat talk. It's what you would need to make sense of in order to identify the cat with something specifiable in terms of these other entities. So I think on such a story, you'd be saying, well, look, there aren't really cats. There's just these particles. That's not identifying the cats with anything you can specify in the other language. It's just denying that there's anything that you can't specify in the language of physics.
Yeah, so what you would be doing would be explaining the applicability of cat vocabulary. So you said that, well, there's something that you're tracking when you employ the...
But you can't specify that in the reduction vocabulary. That's something that you're tracking. What?
Well, so you use the principles of biology, and they sort of operate on the ontology of... I don't know. You'd have to work out the story, but
that's what I'm denying you could do.
Okay.
Look, aid and comfort is given to this way of thinking by thinking model theoretically, because you start off with a domain of objects, and everything else you define, set theoretically in terms of those, and those objects in the domain, they don't come with any sortals. You're not told about that. They're just sort of objects or particulars that you've got. But you have to be able to count the elements in the domain, individuate them even if there's an uncountable number of them. And that you can't do using these pseudo-sortals of object domain element in particular, and so on. So the right way to think about it, I think, is that you have to specify the domain in a richer meta language that has sortals. And then you can say, well, for the purposes of the model, we'll ignore those sortals. But if we're really thinking about identities of cats and the things we can pick out in a language where we can pick out particles, then we've got to look carefully at how where the sortals come from.
The base vocabulary is sortalized, so it's not like you
Right.
have these
We
sortals,
can
and then you
we can tell the
principles
baryons.
for these things
We can tell the
interacting.
baryons apart, but and we can do mereological sums of them, but they have nothing to do with the.
Yeah, so I wasn't
sort of
thinking in terms of
arrangements of
mereological sums. I was thinking of like emergent principles from the interaction of the things that give you something sort of. Yeah. Anyway, I don't know. I mean, obviously he doesn't tell the story here, but it's not obvious to me that there's not a story
That
to be told.
it is broken
Uh-huh.
back.
I don't
Okay.
know.
But so I mean, I suppose the slogan, I'm saying one hypothesis, one strand of thought that I think is in play is distinguish between the ontology and the ideology in the way he wants to do anyway in the nominalism essays, and then say the primacy of the scientific image over the manifest image is in ontology. It gets to say of what is that it is. It gets to say what there is, but not what it is, just what there is, the objects. But at the level of ideology, you can't map those one onto the other. That's the level of parity between these. And then the objection I want to make is there isn't any ontology without ideology. You've got to have concepts to pick out these objects. So thinking that you can separate these in this way is just, in the end, confused. That's to say, Wittgenstein's right in the first proposition of the Tractatus. You have to think of the world as a world of facts, not as a world of objects. Objects would have to be picked out by some sortals. That's a matter of facts about them. Yeah.
On that way of thinking about things, are bare particulars unintelligible?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, we get to them sort of by abstraction,
Right.
but yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So in mentioning the strongly cross-sortals identities argument that you make, you noted that the thought you have here is bound up with a hostility to the idea of contingent identities that we also find in, for instance, Kripke. I take it that you're thinking about naming necessity there chiefly. Now, I would have thought that if you endorsed the same conclusions as Kripke did, you might have to do so for somewhat different reasons because of, you yourself have said that you think the third wave of the modal revolution was a mistake. There's massive difference in background commitments between you and the Kripke of naming a necessity there. So when you allude to Kripke there, are you just mentioning him as somebody who ultimately comes to the same conclusion as you do, or are you actually wanting to take on board any of the arguments that he makes?
No, it's the former. You're quite right. Just mean to point out that where fans of contingent identity, here locus classicus is Alan Gibbard, whose example is Lumpel and Goliath, where Lumpel is the lump of clay that existed before the statue Goliath that was a shaping of it, and survives after Goliath gets squashed and is gone, Lumpel survives that change and Goliath doesn't, and he wants to say, well, but there's a period of time when Lumpel and Goliath are identical. And I take it, and this is by no means uncontroversial, but I take it that sort of where the dust has settled on that is to say, no, it's not going to work to claim that they're identical at any point. And if we identify and individuate lumps of clay differently than we do statues, what we can say is there's an identity-like relation of material constitution, but for instance, it's not like identity in that it's not a symmetric relation, but it's a peculiarly intimate relation that Lumpel stands into Goliath, but it's not identity. But yes, Kripke's reasons for denying that are quite different from mine. He believes in extensional empirical properties, for instance.
Yeah, because I've always found it somewhat puzzling that you tend to invoke Kripke here and reach the same conclusions, given that the reasons Kripke has for going in for these things, and I take it the reasons most people will give for going in for these things who go in for them, are ones that you could never actually endorse.
Yep. No, it's true, and I should distinguish. It's not in that sense an invocation of his authority. Okay, I think there's another idea that's in play here, which is this third option in quote 44, that manifest objects are appearances to human minds of a reality which is constituted by systems of imperceptible particles. This is the line that Sellars devotes his Locke lectures to. Just a couple years later than this, this is his scientific naturalist version of Kant's phenomena noumena distinction, saying what science is authoritative about is what there really is, the noumena. And the manifest image consists exclusively of phenomenal appearances. Now, phenomenal in a sapient sense rather than a sentient sense, that is, conceptualizations of these things, applications of concepts to these things. But they should all, in a metaphysical sense, be understood as expressing appearances of those scientific things. On this account, science comes with its ontology and its ideology, and the manifest image also has its ideology. It's just that we think of this asymmetric relation between them, and what we're eventually to do is get veridical appearances of them. The veridical appearances we have are the ones we get from science. Now, a way of thinking about now, I also think this is sort of a bad idea, but it's not as bad as the other idea, and some of the things he says right at the end suggest a version of it that there might be some go-to. So I said clumsily when I was introducing this line of thought that I was going to distinguish two lines that Sellars was taking, or maybe three, because one of them might be a version of the other, and that's what I mean here. So here's the most sophisticated reading that I can give, the reading that sort of attributes the best view to him. And this would be to distinguish between cognitive and practical dimensions of vocabulary use, and see the scientific image as authoritative about the cognitive, the descriptions and explanations of things, determining what's knowledge, with the manifest image authoritative about practical things, about the doings of persons, about discursive practices. So then we acknowledge that the manifest image is articulating the context in which the language game of science is played, the practices of describing and explaining are conducted. And this is the sense in which, without thinking of its embedding in the manifest image, the scientific image is incomplete. It's incomplete because although it's got by its own lights a descriptively and explanatorily complete system, that system doesn't include the activities of describing and explaining. Those are norm-governed, concept-using activities, which are what the perennial philosophy studies in thinking about and articulating the manifest image. Now, here, if we think of the manifest image as, I'll come back to that. This is what he's talking about in the very last passage here, which is the last paragraph of the essay. To complete the scientific image, we need to enrich it not with more ways of saying what is the case. Now, that's on the side of ideology, but it's on the side of the cognitive. But with the language of community and individual intentions, that's going to be his version of the manifest image. So that by construing the actions we intend to do and the circumstances in which we intend to do them in scientific terms, we directly relate the world as conceived by scientific theory to our purposes and make it our world and no longer an alien appendage to the world in which we do our living. We can, of course, as matters now stand, realize this indirect incorporation of the scientific image into our way of life only in imagination, but to do so, if only in imagination, is to transcend the dualism of the manifest and scientific images of man and the world. So what I take it he's saying is we have to start adopting the ideology in our practical doings, the conceptual scheme of science. So we have to formulate the objects of our intentions and describe the circumstances under which we will do things, all in the language of science. That will incorporate the descriptive resources of science, its ideology, as the ideology of the manifest image. We'll still have appearances, but they'll be veridical appearances because we're using the right language, the language of science. And that's to gradually replace the ideology that we have in the manifest image. He says, well, I don't know how to do this for things, but for many things, but I can talk about increasing the entropy of the wood instead of setting it on fire. If you hang out with, say, doctors or engineers, you'll find to a remarkable extent they do incorporate that language in their practical interactions with the world. The reason he wants to I think, focus on persons and intentions here is that the real topic is what I invoke under the heading of the normativity of our discursive practices. That's what sort of the framework of persons is standing in for. And he's saying, I'm going to give an account of norms in terms of intentions. The discursive norms that articulate our practices, I'm going to think of in terms of a distinctive kind of intention, we intentions. I intend that we all do such and such under these circumstances. And he says, and if we can specify what the doings are and specify the circumstances in articulating the contents of these intentions, if we can do all of that in the language of science, we will have gotten both of these images together. And even if we can't imagine what it would be to fully bring that off, so that there is no residue of unincorporated, unreplaced manifest image stuff. Well, even if we can't imagine bringing that to its asymptotic conclusion, still the description of the possibility shows us that there's no unget-overable incompatibility or incoherence between these images. That's the view, I think, that he's articulating here. I don't think that's compatible with the nominalist science's authoritative about the objects that make up the world, the real world thing. This is giving the scientific ideology an authority as well as the ontological authority. But saying what the scientific image isn't going to do is well, we're still going to have this framework of persons and their intentions. It's just that the cognitive aspect of that is going to come from science. Now, I think there's a mistake here. And I want to say something critical and then something sort of constructive. So the critical thing is, I think the way he's doing this is not the way it ought to be or really could be done. And then I want to say that there's a missed opportunity here. And I'm thinking of this as the way he's reconciling the 36 passage with the 41. He's saying, well, we can come to use the language of science in doing these other things that are not describing and explaining, the things that we do and talk about doing in the manifest image. That's the implicit normativity of discursive practice. Well, let me say something about that. I mean, I talk about normativity a lot more than he does. That's not really his term for this. He uses it on occasion, but it doesn't loom as large in his way of describing these phenomena as it does for me. There's philosophical commitments behind thinking that what's distinctive of the practical and the discursive can be picked out under the heading of normativity. Let me mention one of the niceties in the vicinity. The way I use it, discursive normativity is a special kind of normativity. one of the tasks, as I see it, of a philosopher of language is to say what has to be special, what in the end structure of norms what structure of implicit norms must some practice exhibit to be a practice of giving and asking for reasons, and so of claiming that things are thus and so. But I see that as against a background of practical normativity that isn't yet discursive. That's sometimes called a layer cake theory. Think about normative creatures here, and then some of them get their practices in the right shape to be concept users, and so have discursive practices. But the notion of norms implicit in social practices is broader than the discursive on this account. Kant and Hegel and all the German idealists disagree with that picture. McDowell follows them in this. For them, discursive normativity is normativity. It does make sense to talk about norms that are not conceptually articulated norms. This is a sort of issue that Sellars, I think, doesn't address. I don't see him as on one side or the other of this issue. But what I see him forwarding here and developing in his works in practical philosophy later on, he's already introduced this in the 50s, is the notion of understanding norms in that sense in terms of intentions, discursive norms in terms of we intentions. And this notion has made Sellars latterly a hero of the collective intentionality people who see him as having worked on and worked out this idea sort of decades before they came to be interested in it. But I think it's a mistake to think you can understand discursive normativity in terms of intentions, because the contents of intentions are conceptually articulated. They're at least at the same level. You might think intentions have a special role in them, but you can't understand discursive normativity in terms of intentional states, because intentional states are propositional attitudes. This is what Grice tries to do. But at least in Grice's case, he's saying, well, it's not my job to explain the contents of beliefs and intentions. I'm going to appeal to those contents to explain the contents of utterances, of speech acts. And then we have to say, well, can we really talk about the content forms of things that can't talk, or do we have to have a relational theory of the sort it seems we're getting in EPM, where the capacity to speak and the capacity to think and believe arise together and are unintelligible apart from one another. So Sellars can tell a story, if he wants, about how, for instance, moral normativity can be understood in terms of we intentions. But that's not really a starter for explaining discursive normativity generally. He says persons are the things that have intentions. So he's using the notion of person and intention to talk about normativity generally, and yet that strategy, well, I'm repeating myself, at most would be good for some specific kind of normativity, not for discursive normativity, which might be sort of normativity in general. That's the critical complaint about this. In the writings on practical philosophy, Sellars only talks about really moral normativity. And for all I know, talking about we intentions is an okay way to do that. not the way I would go, but invoking it here when the issue really is discursive normativity, that's what the 36 passage that he's supposed to be bringing together here is about. That's not really doing it. The constructive point is there's a missed opportunity here. There's a way to say something about normativity that he's equipped himself with, which is to think of what you're expressing when you make a norm explicit, when you're using normative vocabulary, as something you would say in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary. To be a pragmatic meta-linguistic expressivist about normative vocabulary, the way he is about alethic modal vocabulary. After all, he told us there in CDCM that the language of modality is a transposed language of norms. Well, he's a metalinguistic expressivist about the modal vocabulary. He could be a metalinguistic expressivist about the normative vocabulary as well. Talk about norms would be understood to be metalinguistic talk in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary that lets us talk about what we're doing in doing things. As I would understand it, normative vocabulary, in its first-hand use, expresses endorsement of patterns of practical reasoning. Now, that would not be a reductive naturalistic account. I mentioned before that Hugh Price distinguishes subject naturalism from object naturalism. Object naturalism is what you get if you have placement problems, if you want to know of some vocabulary, how is it describing the world as being? How is it representing things as being? And furthermore, you think that the things it's representing as being some way have to be specified in some privileged naturalistic vocabulary. But the subject naturalist says, well, maybe the right way to think about this use of the language isn't as describing or explaining. If you're not a global descriptivist, as Sellars urges us not to be, then Price's subject naturalist, somebody like the later Wittgenstein, says, if you can understand how people can use the language in this way, if there's nothing mysterious about that, then you needn't ask the question that the object naturalist asks, how can we specify in our preferred naturalistic vocabulary how you're describing things as being, or how you're representing things as being? So in the paradigm case, don't worry about finding the natural numbers in your world of physics, these things that don't have mass and exert no forces, don't occupy any place, any spatiotemporal region. If you can understand how we learn to count, and then after counting, how we learn how to add and do arithmetic, if you can give a naturalistic account of that, then the conclusion you should draw from that is, well, maybe we shouldn't think of those singular terms as having the job of picking out particular objects. We should just think about the role they play in those practices. Now, Price is a subject naturalist. I don't know whether Wittgenstein was. That is, Price thinks, well, we'll tell our story about the use of this, these expressions in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary that is itself a naturalistic vocabulary. My view is in order to be describing these terms as meaningful, you have to use a normative, pragmatic metavocabulary. In that sense, it's rock bottom. Not because it's sort of foundational, it's just unavoidable. The normative vocabulary, the use of that vocabulary can't be specified in non-normative terms. For instance, in terms of the intentions that people have. But we can still say in a normative vocabulary how people learn to use inter alia normative vocabulary. So it seems to me that there's a missed opportunity here. If Sellars had just taken his strategy that he used for looks talk, that he used for talk of necessity and possibility, that he used for talk of universals and propositions, and applied that to the normative case, rather than trying a reductive account in terms of intentions, that this both would be a more sustainable strategy and in keeping with the insights that he'd had over this decade period. Yeah, Douglas.
Yeah. So you've been speaking of Sellars' strategy here as seeking to understand the normative in terms of intentions, and you've characterized that as an attempt to give a reductive account of the normative in terms of something non-normative. But it wouldn't have been obvious to me at all that Sellars' attempt to understand the normative in terms of intentions is an attempt to reduce the normative to something non-normative. Indeed, I would have thought the opposite, because I would have thought that Sellars' understanding of what intentions are is, well, still itself normative.
Well,
attributions of intentions are themselves expressions of intention.
I mean, that's certainly a more charitable reading. But I think that he thinks of intentions in Rileyan terms. Our Rileyan ancestors, that section of EPM, he thinks at that point, and I think he seems to have, continued to think this way, that Ryle told us how to think about intentional states as opposed to the mental episodes that Jones postulated as originally as unobservables. And Ryle's account is dispositional. It's in terms of a modal vocabulary, but not in terms of a normative vocabulary. Now, maybe that isn't the way Sellars is thinking about intentions, but when he's thinking about incorporating all of this, incorporating the scientific picture into this, I think that he's thinking of Ryle, although he was working in sort of perennial philosophical terms, as showing us sort of how to do that. And I mean, one of the things that he says in the passage just above this, if we look at the penultimate and antepenultimate passages, 56 and 57, above this, if you say that a certain person desired to do A, thought it was his duty to do B, was forced to do C, that's not to describe him. One does indeed describe him, but one does something more. What does that more consist? Well, we're talking about the irreducibility of the personal as the irreducibility of the ought to the is, but more basic than this, that ultimately we shall see the 2 points coincide, given how little he says after this, the we shall see is aspirational. To think of a featherless biped as a person is to construe its behavior in terms of actual and potential membership in an embracing group, each member of which thinks of itself as a member of the group. Let's call that a community. That's the one that can have we intentions. Now, the fundamental principles of a community which define what's correct or incorrect, right or wrong, done or not done, are the most common intentions of that community with respect to the behavior of members of the group. It follows that to recognize a featherless biped or dolphin or Martian as a person requires that one think thoughts of the form, we, one, shall do or abstain from doing actions of kind A in circumstances of C. To think thoughts of this kind is not to classify or explain, but to rehearse an intention. Is he thinking of that intention as irreducibly ought-like? Or, okay, I'm missing. One of the passages. Sorry. He says in between 57 and 58 there that to understand these things, we're going to have to understand the way the group mediates between, sort of my behavior because I'm appealing to these we intentions. And he says that was completely impossible in the non-postulational manifest image. It was evolutionary theory that told us by postulating unobservable processes of evolution that told us how groups could do this. I should have left this passage in the handout once because it's forging an important link for him. But again, I think it's grist for a reductive reading. Now, it may be that this is another place where Millikan has shown us the way forward, how it can both be evolutionary and normative in here. I don't know that she's ever sort of put that view forward as a reading of what he's doing at the end here, but it may well be.
Yeah, I mean, you've quoted from here exactly the passages that I would have thought support thinking when Sellars is thinking about intentions and what we're doing when we attribute intentions. He's not thinking about that as something non-normative, and so, an account. He's giving an account of the normative in terms of intentions, or at least endorsing an account of that sort. Maybe not giving one here. But I don't think that's something that's
irreducibility of the ought to the is.
Yeah.
You're thinking that these are sort of part of one story, rather than that he thinks you could tell the intention story first and then get the norms out of it.
I mean, he's endorsing a story on which we understand normative statuses in terms of normative attitudes, and there are things you could mean by that which aren't good sorts of things to mean, but there also are things you could mean by that which are very good sorts of things to mean.
Okay, well, look, there's one last thing I want to say about this. The issue that I think he's seeing philosophy is addressing and talking about in sort of the terms that he has available here isn't principally Eddington's two tables, the scientific one of the quizzing colorless particles and the manifest image one, though that's obviously coming up. It's more C.P. Snow's two cultures, the natural scientific culture and the humanistic one that's concerned principally with texts, the Naturwissenschaft and the Geisteswissenschaft. And the question really is, I think, how do we get a synoptic vision of the world as presented to us by eventual natural science and its kind of understanding, and the understanding of things that can talk, of discursive creatures, the texts they produce, the sort of everything that's inextricably bound up with their discursive practices. Of course, the scientists themselves are discursive practitioners. Is there, in principle, methodologically, a different kind of understanding that we have to each other as things that can talk, that's exhibited in reading a text or understanding what somebody says, than the kind of understanding that's deployed for things that can't talk in the natural sciences? That, I think, in the end, is what he's challenging us to get into one synoptic vision, to get to see stereoscopic perspectives that we can combine in that way, and is understanding this as at least the task of philosophy since the Enlightenment, when we've really had the scientific understanding of it, is to get that together with the broadly hermeneutic understanding that we have of each other. And Sellars is sort of heroically giving us pieces of a puzzle and assembling them here. But the fact that I think in the end we don't get a really clear picture isn't really to be held against him, given sort of how large an issue this is. But the perennial philosophy is principally concerned, I think, with us, and with other stuff only insofar as it's sort of involved with us. And the new scientific, the modern philosophy, is still concerned with that, but now has this other job of rethinking what we are and what forms of understanding we have, given that it's turned out that the best way we have of understanding stuff that can't talk is this natural scientific way of understanding it. What does that tell us about the world we're talking in, and about our understanding of it and of each other, given that that's the best way to talk about and understand things that can't themselves talk? And I think a big divide in contemporary philosophy is whether you think that there is another form of understanding that is specific to understanding things that are themselves understanders, that are talkers, or not. If you think no, one way or another, either the object naturalist way, don't think it's going to happen that way, or a subject naturalist way, the scientific form of understanding is going to absorb the hermeneutic form of understanding. One of the principal tools of doing that would be a mathematical semantics. If we could really get a mathematical grip on meaning in linguistics, informal semantics, that would be a principal tool in bringing this off. But where we ended up might still be irreducibly normative. I'm going to say social science is a science too, or sciences too. Okay. Next time we're going to read his Being and Being Known. It's, I wanted to do this so there'd be some sort of pulling together. Being and Being Known is a paradigm example of him doing philosophy and doing history of philosophy in an interdigitated way. It's his reading of Thomism and what we can learn about the philosophy of mind from it. and it's not an essay to be missed. So that's for next time.